You're listening to Summit Church, where faith comes alive and Jesus is at the center. For more information, go to our website at wearesummit.ca or find us on socials. Thanks for connecting, and stay watching for this week.
So, as a bit of a start off, I think something to tell you, there's something about me that my family knows that some people find a bit odd, which may not surprise you. I actually enjoy reading manuals. Yeah, is anyone else with me? No one else as well. There's one person. I like reading manuals so much that I've been known to, if I buy something new, so like a piece of tech equipment or a camera or something like that, I love the fact that we're in this modern age where you can actually download the manual ahead of time. And I like to download the manual and then read it kind of like, front to back, just so that I can know everything about whether if it's a camera, like what all the buttons do, all the settings, everything. I love it. It's fantastic. And for me, it's about the idea that when I receive the thing, now I already know kind of how it all works. And it just gives me great joy and great pleasure. And I know that's not everyone's preference. The thing for me is that reading the manual actually increases my excitement about the thing that's coming. And then the manual's not valuable because it replaces the experience, but it's valuable because for me it prepares me to fully enjoy the experience when it arrives. See the segue coming? So I think that's, when I've looked at the topic of hope, I think that's how hope works. This idea of kind of like being prepared or anticipating what's coming and then doing something that helps you receive it. Does that make sense? So hope is not simply wishing something good might happen. Hope is actually allowing the reality of what's coming to shape how you live today in this moment. It's like a future-orientated anticipation. And hope is one of the central themes of the psalm about Jesus that we're going to read this morning. So, Psalm 16. I'll give you a moment to turn to it if you can. If you've got a Bible with you or an app or whatever. Psalm 16. And this is actually kind of interesting because probably about, I don't want to say maybe 2 months ago, 3 months ago, like in our Thursday night prayer and a bunch of other, Psalm 16 was popping up all the time. Like, man, we were talking about it a whole bunch, like through different groups or whatever we were meeting. So I didn't plan on this being Psalm 16 today, but here it is. So when you're ready, I'll read it all the way through. Oh yeah, good, thank you. For anyone who's visiting, I always feel like I have to explain that. We say, if you found it, let me know. And people do a little whoop whoop to... Anyway, let's just move on before it gets worse. Okay, Psalm 16. Preserve me, O God, for in you I take refuge. I say to the Lord, you are my Lord, I have no good apart from you. As for the saints in the land, they are the excellent ones, in whom is all my delight. The sorrows of those who run after another God shall multiply. Their drink offerings of blood I will not pour out, or take their names on my lips. The Lord is my chosen portion and my cup. You hold my lot. The lines have fallen for me in pleasant places. Indeed, I have a beautiful inheritance. I bless the Lord who gives me counsel. In the night also my heart instructs me. I have set the Lord always before me. Because he is at my right hand, I shall not be shaken. Therefore my heart is glad and my whole being rejoices. My flesh also dwells secure. For you will not abandon my soul to Sheol or let your Holy One see corruption. You make known to me the path of life. In your presence there is fullness of joy. At your right hand are pleasures forevermore. There's a lot in this psalm. And we're picking these psalms because they have a link or a reference to Jesus in some way. The psalm we looked at last week was Psalm 22, about the suffering of Jesus. And that was probably quite an overt or obvious connection to Jesus' experiences because he actually quoted that psalm on the cross. This psalm is a little more subtle in terms of the way that it references Jesus, but it's clearly there. In fact, those who were in the early church in the New Testament considered this a prophetic psalm. Two key figures in particular used this psalm as one of the central passages that they preached from as they preached the gospel. And the first one was Peter in Acts chapter 2. And when Pentecost happened and the believers were gathered in the upper room and the Holy Spirit fell on them and they were empowered, they spoke in tongues, flames of fire, and then Peter stood up and preached a message, which in itself is quite a remarkable event, and it tells you about what happens when the Holy Spirit fills a person. Is that they go from this place where they're, like Peter was essentially hiding from the authorities, afraid they were going to be caught by the Jewish authorities or the Romans for what they were doing, but then all of a sudden now he's in the marketplace, not just kind of like in full view, but then actually preaching the gospel to the crowd of thousands that are gathered there. And his message, it says that 3,000 believers became followers of Jesus in that one moment. And I mean, I've preached a few sermons, but that's never happened to me. Yet. But one of the things that Peter said in his message was that he mentioned this psalm as proof that Jesus was the one who rose from the dead. Also, Paul, in Acts 13, as he went to this place called Antioch and preached to the gathered Jews in the synagogue, he went to the synagogue and talked about Jesus and talked about the gospel. He also used this psalm to give essential support to the idea that Jesus was resurrected from the dead. And if you're not curious about where they're getting that from, well, there's this idea that David wrote this psalm, but actually he wrote it partly about his own experience, but also prophetically about the future. If you look, if you've got it open before you, you can see there's a few verses here that are pretty key to this idea. Verse 10 and 11, it says, "For you will not abandon my soul to Sheol," which is the grave or death. Sheol is that word for the world's kind of underneath, not heaven, not paradise. "Or let your Holy One see corruption." And again, in your translation, corruption you might have decay as a word there. Basically, it means rotting in the grave. That's what it means. So David is saying, if you will not abandon my soul to Sheol, or let your Holy One see corruption. But what will happen? You will make known to me the path of life. In your presence there is fullness of joy. Your right hand there are pleasures evermore. So here's the thinking, or the kind of logical thinking of Paul as he preached from this message, and Peter as well, is that David wrote Psalm 16, but David died. David's tomb is still in Jerusalem. Therefore, David did experience decay. Like he did experience. So when these verses are saying, "You will not abandon my soul to Sheol, or let your Holy One see decay or corruption," or whatever that word kind of is in your translation, David did experience that. Therefore, David must have been speaking prophetically about someone else. Someone else, not him. Can't be David, because David did die, was put in the grave, did see corruption, did see decay. So there must be something else, or someone else that this is speaking of. Someone who went through that process, but then the next verse says that they've been brought to life. They've been given the path of life, that they're in the Lord's presence where there's fullness of joy. So for centuries, or for a long time, studies, and Paul would have done this, like in his training as a rabbi, he would have been looking at passages like this that predicted this mysterious person who's going to come, who's going to die, but he's not going to see decay, who's going to be given life again. And so they've been having this question for such a long time. And I wonder if you could put yourself in their shoes, or imagine what that's like, to be searching over the decades, over the years. There's this person that we know, Psalm 16, that David wrote about, someone who's going to die but is not going to stay dead, they're going to come alive again. That you've got that question before you. And then for Peter and for Paul and for everyone else who was part of the early church, the answer basically became real. Because that person that David was writing about was Jesus. Jesus was the one who died but didn't see decay and rose to life again. So this is a prophetic psalm about Jesus and his resurrection. And this was so strong for the early church and for believers in the early church that for Peter it's the first passage he thought about when before those 3,000 people on Pentecost to prove to them or to say to them, this Jesus that you crucified is now alive, as predicted by David, prophesied in Psalm 16 all those years ago. So this psalm is about the resurrected King, Jesus. There's something about the resurrection of Jesus that we can explore more, because it's there are truths in the Bible that are exciting. They're impressive. There's something about the resurrection of Jesus that proves he is who he was prophesied to be, who was predicted to be, who he said he was. But there's more, because there's a dynamic about the resurrection that affects us right now in this moment in our life. What does this mean for us and those who choose to put their trust in him? Well, the resurrection means that we can have a new identity. We're no longer defined by our past. I think what you need to grab hold of here is this idea that the resurrection is all about the death happened, but then life came after that. And because Jesus achieved victory over death and victory over all things that were related to sin and death and darkness, when we come into union with him, as we believe in him, that we can experience those things too. So we can have a new identity that 2 Corinthians 5:17 says, if anyone is in Christ, the new creation has come. The old has gone, the new is here. Because what happened for Jesus is that he rose, and when he rose, he wasn't the old person. Does that make sense? He wasn't the old Jesus. There was something about him that was different. People recognized that. He had a body, but it was a new body. It was him, but there was a new creation aspect to who he was. There was something different. He was part of a new kingdom, a new moment. And so for us, the dynamic of the resurrection means that the same thing happens for us, that we can have a new identity. We are no longer defined by our past when we come into this place of faith in Jesus. That Jesus then, in defeating sin, and basically for those who trust him, making them new, that we are a new creation. The old is gone, the new is here. The second thing about the resurrected Jesus that impacts us is we have a new way to live. We can live from resurrected power today. The resurrection is not only about where we go after death, it's about what happens to us now. Romans 6 says, we are therefore buried with him through baptism into death, in order that just as Christ was raised from the dead, we too may live a new life. So the resurrection of Jesus has this power that as we put our faith in him, the resurrection power of Jesus comes to promote new life in us. Something that we couldn't do by ourselves. But to live for the Lord in a way that we are created to live. The last thing is that we have a new hope. Our future is secure because Jesus rose. Death is not the end. Suffering is not meaningless. Loss is not permanent. God's restoration is coming. God, in Romans 6 again, it says, since we've been unified with him in his death, we will also be raised as he was. So the resurrection of Jesus has an immediate impact on who we are as we put our faith in him. But the thing I want to focus on about this resurrection and this dynamic of from death to life, as talked about in Psalm 16, is one particular thing, as what I hinted at the beginning, is this idea of hope. There's a huge dynamic of hope resident in the resurrection. If you could put yourself in the shoes of the disciples or his followers, you were expecting Jesus to do something incredibly victorious. In fact, many Jews believed that they were waiting for a Messiah who would basically come and restore Israel as a nation to them. In other words, kick the Romans out, be a political leader and a military leader, and basically win the battle and then establish Israel as a nation, and everything will be back to the way it should be. So if you're expecting that, and then he gets killed on a cross, those things could be quite jarring, should we say. The hope that you had has now been dashed. But then all of a sudden, in the place where you think everything is not going as it should be, he defeats death and rises again. There's something in that which we need to figure out for ourselves. That is hope. The concept that everything we see that is not as the Lord wants it will eventually come to the place of resurrection where there's life. Everything that's dead will become new. So hope is an important thing for us as believers. I want to give you a provocative phrase. Hope in Jesus is not an emotion, it's an orientation. I want to say that again. Hope in Jesus is not an emotion, it's an orientation. And I want to say that, not to say that emotions are bad. In fact, sometimes we feel hopeful. It's great. God created emotions. They're an essential part of our walk with Jesus. But I want to challenge the notion that hope resides in how we feel about life or how we feel about our present challenges. We're looking to feel a certain way. Because I think scriptural hope, biblical hope, the way that I see people in the Bible exhibit hope is it's more about a trusting anticipation. Trusting anticipation. It's living today because you're convinced of what God has promised for tomorrow. Does that make sense? So hope becomes a way of living, not just a way of thinking or a way of feeling. You doing okay? I want to give you a few examples of what I think this means from a scriptural perspective. That hope means living in the present according to what you believe is going to happen in the future. Like a farmer plants because he hopes for a good harvest. That's what I think biblical hope is really like. That there's a sowing with a confidence and a trust there's going to be a reaping and a harvest. You do something now because of your anticipation of what is promised in the future. Does that make sense? Also, you could say, well, maybe athletes are a good example because they train for a race. They train for victory. They train their hardest because they hope that when the race comes, they're going to be able to win. They train as hard as they can. They do something in the present because of a confidence or anticipation of the future. You could also perhaps say, this is maybe not quite as strong, but those in construction lay a foundation before the house is built. There's an anticipation and a trust that eventually something's going to be built upon what you're laying right now. Does that make sense? So hope really shapes today's decisions. So perhaps the question becomes for us, like, what future are we living towards? What future with Jesus are we living towards right now? What are you sowing in confidence that there will be a harvest? What are you doing in the sense of training like an athlete in confidence that you will run to the finish and win the prize with Jesus? The answer for us is a future with a resurrected Jesus in his glorious kingdom for all eternity. That's what we're going towards. Our future is this moment where we will be with the resurrected Jesus in his kingdom for all eternity. And that starts now. It's not something that's just in the future. But I wonder, the question is, hope really talks about how are you living towards that moment? What are you doing to build towards that? You know, for me, as a pastor, that's a key thing to be reminded of. Like if I'm just here to manage an organization or to do good community things. I mean, there's lots of value in that. There's lots of good things to do. But I think that what really sustains ministry or sustains me is keeping hold of this idea that whatever I do right now, it needs to be with Jesus and for Jesus, with the idea that it's going to be part of an eternal kingdom that's going to last forever. But actually the things I do now, they're actually part of God's kingdom, and that's a kingdom that's going to continue on. Not that's just going to finish at one point. But this, what we build here right now, is not just about whether we look good to the community, or if I preach a good sermon, or whatever it is. It's all about the idea that this is part of living towards the fact that Jesus, I'm going to be with Jesus. And all the things that we do right now are going to have an eternal impact. And I think for me that's something I need to keep in mind and keep central to what I do. But it's not easy. Sometimes it's just, you're just in the middle, or you're present to the challenges that you're facing right now. And it's hard to live in a way that is future orientated. The other thing that happens for Christians and believers when they start living in this anticipation of the future, or this hope, is that we become communicators of hope. Peter, again, in his letter, first letter, said this: in your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. Yet do it with gentleness and respect. Gentleness and respect is a good one, isn't it? There's not a lot of gentleness and respect around right now. If you're on the cork board on Facebook, then I don't think gentleness and respect is necessarily a kind of a flavor of Facebook communications about things. It's interesting to me how countercultural that kind of is, right? That we're called to give a reason for our hope, but do it with gentleness and respect. But the thing that Peter assumes in this verse, be prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. He assumes people are going to ask you for the reason why you're so hopeful, or why you live in such a hopeful manner. The early church, they just assumed that people are going to see, not through their words or through the board they put on the front of the church or something else, or what they posted on social media. They were going to see the activity of how they lived, and people were going to ask them, how come you live in such a hopeful way? And he's saying, be ready for that moment, because you need to give a reason for the hope that's in you. It's good for us to understand that church we don't proclaim hope primarily through clever words, even good sermons, or good social media posts. Like, it's demonstrated through how we live our lives. I think the idea, or the analogy that's come to me as I was looking at this, is the idea of a compass. Like whenever you look at a compass, it always points somewhere, right? Hopefully if it's a good compass. Or if you're not standing at the North Pole or something. But the point of a compass is it points in a particular direction. It always points to something. Always points north, right? I think for me, that's a helpful analogy of the idea of what hope looks like in believers. Is that as people look at us, just like a compass points to north, our life points towards hope in Jesus, points towards Jesus. That people can see, oh, there's something about the orientation of this person's life that preserves hope in them. I don't think that necessarily begins with having all the answers. In fact, the early church spread hope because they embodied a different way of living, not because they had every answer that they needed to have for people. But imagine this for a moment, if as a church, we became known as a people who remained peaceful in uncertainty, that we were known as people who forgave when others retaliate towards us, that we were known for giving generously when others in our culture hoard things, we stay faithful when others quit, we grieve honestly without despairing, And we speak of the future with confidence rather than fear. Imagine what it would be like if we were a people like that. I think the honest truth is that, to a certain degree, we are a people like that. In many ways. My prayer is that the Lord would take us even further towards that picture of who we could be. So what can we do to put this hope at the center or foundation of who we are? This is where the psalm comes in again, because the psalmist David says something in his psalm that's pretty challenging, I think, but also for me I found pretty inspirational. In verse 8, he gives us the answer about how to put more hope at the center of our lives. He says, I have set the Lord always before me, because he is at my right hand, I shall not be shaken. I have set the Lord always before me. That small phrase is, when you really think about it, it's actually pretty challenging. I have set the Lord always before me. It's the idea that whatever you're doing, wherever you are, whether you're waking, going to bed, whatever it is, that you've actually set the Lord before you, that the Lord is always in front of you, that you're always observing him or seeing him or interacting with him or present with him. What a challenge. I have set the Lord always before me in everything that I do, because he is at my right hand, I shall not be shaken. You know, David doesn't say, I occasionally thought about God. I just occasionally let my mind drift towards God. It's intentional, it's continual, it's practiced. I think resurrection hope that we're talking about grows out of a daily reorientation towards Jesus. The practice of being in his presence. Recognizing his presence in our daily moments. Being in prayer about all things. I have this weird idea that when I grew up in church culture when I was younger, it kind of felt like most of the time, it's like we did the Jesus stuff when we were at church, and then the rest of the week we just did the normal things that everyone else did. And in fact, like one of the things that really struck me as I was growing up is that amongst my friends, when I was in a new city, that we would go to church together and we would worship together, but then when we were out other places, whether we were going to a restaurant or enjoying life somewhere else, we never talked about Jesus or faith at all. And I was just kind of a bit curious about why that was. And that's partly a cultural thing. It's the same with some of my family when we grew up. It was like we could talk, we could be in church and it seemed to be okay there. But when you're outside of church, it was like, well, we don't really talk about stuff very much. We'll talk about faith. And it kind of like, I know British culture is like Canadian culture, but it's like, it seems like there's certain moments where it's okay to be a certain way and other moments where it's not. It's kind of uncomfortable to be talking about faith or Jesus in certain circumstances where it's comfortable in others. And it's like, have you ever noticed that you could go to a hockey game and go crazy, basically, and jump and yell and wave your hands in the air and sing the national anthem with all gusto, whatever else is going on. But when you come into church, it's like, it's a bit uncomfortable. I don't know whether we should be doing that kind of thing. You know, it's like, it's the same in England. Like I'm a big rugby fan, and I've been to a few big games, and when you're in the stands, like the rugby fans, they'll sing old hymns from church, like at the top of their lungs. And then you put it into church and everyone's like, and not everyone's like that, I understand. I'm kind of exaggerating for the point. But I'm curious about this idea that David is presenting, that there's a consistency and intentionality about being with the Lord always before me. That sounds a bit extreme. Really? Like, every moment? Like, wow, that seems a lot, doesn't it? Like, I don't know if that's really what... But I think that's true. I think that it's the life that we are designed to live with Jesus. You know, the Lord looks at it like his relationship with the church, he looks a bit like he counts himself as us the bride and him the bridegroom. There's an analogy from married life in that. Lucy, Tim, sorry to pick on you. I had a really interesting moment when I was working in a bank, and Zoe and I got engaged, and we were going to get married. I invited my colleagues to our wedding, and one of the guys took me aside and he said, "Simon, I just want to check something," because he knew that we didn't live together before we were married. He said, "When you get married, are you going to live in the same house together?" And I was like, "Yeah." Like, he just didn't know because I was a Christian whether that was a thing or not. And I was like, "Yeah, we're going to live in the same house. Sorry to say this, but we might even sleep in the same bed." I mean, that might be something that happens. There's something about the analogy of marriage is that, like, it would be crazy, wouldn't it? Like, to think that marriage is really all about the idea that when you get married to another person, that you just kind of like, I don't know, just book a few times a week that you're together. Right? That's not how it works. You're supposed to be together, to live together, to love each other. Like, to want to do everything together. Most things together. Almost everything. 98% of things we want to do together. There's some things that still we don't do together. But the point of this is this idea that this is the way that not only the early church, but also David saw life with Jesus, life with the Lord. Like that kind of intimate connection, doing life with each other, sharing experiences together. And I think that it's like maybe perhaps some of us think that only the best stuff we reserve for being with the Lord, the most religious stuff or the most kind of holy stuff, and we don't bother with him all the rest. But I don't think that's how the Lord wants it. He wants to be involved in everything. He wants to be present in everything. And I think for us, what happens when he's present with everything is that the resurrection power of the risen Jesus then promotes a sense of hope in us that we could never get through any other experience. So I want to say it one more time. Hope in Jesus. Remember, hope is not just a feeling. It's this anticipation of what the future holds, what God's got in store for us. The hope in Jesus is not an emotion, it's an orientation. So I want to just invite the worship team up, and we'll finish with this. So I want to just encourage you this week, when uncertainty comes, set the Lord before you. This is what David said, "I have set the Lord always before me." So when uncertainty comes, set the Lord before you. When fear comes, set the Lord before you. When disappointment comes, set the Lord before you. When you don't know what tomorrow holds, set the Lord before you. Because Jesus is not just our hope for someday, he's our hope for today. And he's risen, and he's with us.